All right, hey guys, Rob here again. I thought I'd make a short little video, and this, by the way, the software I'm using only allows me to make up to a 10-minute video, so you'll never have to watch longer than a 10-minute video. Um, anyway, the topic of this one is on the screen there. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about kind of the history of Americans thinking about wilderness. You see the cover of a great book there, Wilderness in the American Mind. I almost adopted that for this class and made you guys read it, but it's pretty thick, it's pretty dense, and ultimately, really, it's a history book. It's about the history of our thinking about wilderness in this country. And, this is not really a history course, but I thought I could kind of borrow a few passages and summarize the idea in a short video. So that's kind of the purpose of this one. I think I also referenced this video, and it may be relevant to your first reflection piece. Anyway, basically what this book starts out by telling us is that most of human history really was man versus wild. Wilderness was the enemy. It was a dangerous place. I'm actually going to read you a couple of quotes along the way here. But he says early on in the book, the value system of primitive man was structured in terms of survival. He appreciated what contributed to his well-being and feared what he did not control or understand. Later, it goes on to say it became essential to gain control over nature. So, think about that. That should make sense. That was kind of the mindset of most people for most of human history. This was certainly the dominant attitude in Europe, and Europeans brought that attitude to the U.S. when they came here and settled our country. So that was kind of where most Americans' mindset was as they got here. When they got to America, of course, there were Native Americans already here. They were kind of living pretty well in harmony with the world, but most of America was still really wild and undeveloped. It was in a wilderness state. So Europeans came here and had this massive wilderness. Judeo-Christian attitudes also reinforce this, and there's a reference in your reading one of the first couple of weeks to an article by Lynn White Jr. It's pretty famous, where he talks about Christianity and it's how it contributed to the exploitation of nature. But let's see, here's another quote. The Old Testament reveals that the ancient Hebrews regarded the wilderness as a cursed land, and that they associated its forbidding character with lack of water. They talked about the great and terrible wilderness. So, the idea of the Garden of Eden is this beautiful kind of garden that's civilized and tame, and everything else was considered wilderness and scary and evil. There's another one over here. Historians of westward expansion chose the same figure. They conquered the wilderness. They subdued the forest. They reduced the land to fruitful subjection. The image of man in wilderness locked in mortal combat was difficult to forget. So that's the attitude. Here's another line. Transforming the wild into the rural had scriptural precedence. Genesis 1:28, the first commandment of God to man, stated that mankind should increase, conquer the earth, and have dominion over all living things. So, that's kind of the attitude that most Americans had in the early days. So, you can kind of imagine the pioneers going about westward expansion, traveling throughout the country. Their idea was that they were conquering the wilderness, conquering nature, and doing God's work in doing so. One last quote. They said in here, the author says, constant exposure to wilderness gave rise to fear and hatred on the part of those who had to fight it for survival and success. Although there were a few exceptions, American frontiersmen rarely judged wilderness with criteria other than the utilitarian, meaning what can they get from it, or spoke of their relation to it in other than a military metaphor. So it's like they were at war with nature. It was their children and grandchildren removed from a wilderness condition who began to sense its ethical and aesthetic values. So that kind of leads to the next step there. The early pioneers had this attitude of having to subdue nature. America, wilderness was a hostile, dangerous place, needed to be conquered, all that. You kind of get the point. Obviously, what this led to was exploitation. We were cutting down the forests, damming up rivers, doing all these kinds of things. And by like the early 1900s, a few people were starting to question that and become concerned about it. So that's kind of the birth of the wilderness movement, I guess, if you will. So you got this era of development. People are getting on trains and going out and seeing the countryside. Cars become widespread. People begin to be able to travel. So they started to get out and appreciate wilderness a little bit. Oh, that's off the screen. I'm sorry about that. Basically, what this slide is supposed to tell you is that Europe was heavily developed. It was either industry or farming, and there's really very little wilderness left in Europe. So most of Europe looks like the picture you see in the background here. While it's beautiful, it's definitely not wild. So Americans, this is part of the slide you can't see, Americans started to begin to appreciate what they had. They started to say, hey, Europe looks like that. Europe is all developed and cultivated and civilized. We still have some beautiful places left. So these beautiful places in America actually became a source of patriotism, and they inspired a lot of art and writing and things like that. So attitudes started to change. These are some slides I stole from the Forest Service on history and purpose of the Wilderness Act. But what they tell you is that in the early days, when America started having public lands, we used our public lands. We used them for timber. We used them for damming and things like that. So our public lands were really exploited too in the early days. A few thinkers, you'll read about these guys in the book, but a few thinkers came along and started to question that and start to talk about the value of wilderness just for its own sake. So that's a big part of what you'll be reading in the first couple of weeks. The Wilderness Act was signed in 1964, so in the years leading up to that, there were all kinds of issues and controversies involving dam construction, developments planned in places like the Appalachian Trail, the Everglades, Shenandoah National Park. So, those kinds of issues really led to an interest in protecting our public lands and gaining new ones. Howard Zahniser, I think that's how you pronounce his name, is another guy that you will read about, but it's worth mentioning. He is the principal author of the Wilderness Act. He's he was an early leader of the Sierra Club and the Wilderness Society, but he is probably the driving force and the most important figure in actually writing the Wilderness Act and helping to get it passed. Don't forget that this was the 1960s, so there was a lot of other stuff going on, hippie stuff and civil rights stuff, and it was an interesting time. Just wanted to kind of point that out. Most significant event of 1964, you're supposed to say it's the Wilderness Act, but some people would say it was the Ford Mustang. Who knows? All right, I think we're almost done here. You have the text of the Wilderness Act in the Knowles book. I don't expect you to read it, skim it. You'll refer to it off and on throughout the class, but it's pretty amazing to think that there were 66 revisions to it, 18 public hearings, all this. It was a lot of work, a lot of controversy, a lot of compromise, but eventually it was passed in 1964. Great quote here from President Johnson as he signed it. If future generations are to remember us with gratitude rather than contempt, we must leave them more than the miracles of technology. We must leave them with a sense of the world as it was in the beginning, not just after we got through with it. It's pretty good. I like that. Anyway, that's pretty much it. That's a little bit of the history and background. And as a result, we've saved some really beautiful places. So there you go. As always, let me know if you have any questions.